Hello and welcome. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by an old friend, well, not so old, but Bridget McNulty, who I interviewed a couple of years ago, a couple of years ago, about her book called Daily Glimmers, which was all about supporting people really on a day-to-day basis. But apart from being a published author, Bridget actually happens to run the largest online diabetes community in South Africa. And today we're going to talk, not actually, well, we will talk about diabetes, but really we're going to talk about the community and what it means belonging to a community for people, why Bridget set it up, and what her views are on the value that communities bring to people. So, welcome, Bridget.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. What a joy to be here.
So let's talk about Sweet Life. So Sweet Life is, as I said, South Africa's largest online diabetes community. And what do you think people were missing that made them want to join you and stay? That sounds very rude, but actually stay with you.
So I was diagnosed with diabetes 18 years ago, type 1 diabetes. And when I was diagnosed, I felt like the only person in the world who had ever been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And the funny thing is that I've spoken to so many people since then who all felt exactly the same way. It feels, when you're given a chronic condition diagnosis, it feels so personal and unique to you that it seems impossible that others could possibly understand what you're going through, and also that they could be going through a similar thing. And at the time, I was given a lot of information and education. I read everything I could find. I'm a writer and a reader. And everything I read said, you're now at greater risk of heart disease, kidney failure, blindness, amputation, stroke. Nowhere did it say, or you can live a perfectly happy, healthy life with diabetes if you get the right care and look after yourself. And so I discovered that on my own pretty quickly. And I really wanted to form a community for others when they were newly diagnosed or after they've been living with it for a while, for us all to recognize that we're not doing it on our own. And the deep exhaustion that comes from managing a chronic condition 24/7, 365 is perfectly normal and acceptable, and actually just part of the mental health side of living with a condition. So I know that that's what people resonate with, right? We are none of us solo creatures. None of us want to be living in a world on our own. And it is such a relief when you find your people and the people who speak your language, and you don't have to explain every little part of your condition to them.
Yes. And I think actually you've highlighted one of the real problems of finding healthcare online is that you hear all the practical, well, I'm not going to say practical things, but all the actual facts about the illness. And of course, you always home in on the worst possible scenarios, which actually most of the time aren't necessarily relevant to you. They're always the extreme case. So, my next question is, obviously there is a big divide in South Africa between public and private healthcare. I'm actually wondering how different it actually probably is to the UK now, as our divide
Yeah.
is also, we also have a divide now. And how do you create a community that feels relevant and useful to people whose experiences actually are
Yeah,
quite
they are
different?
starkly different. So 85% of South Africans access their care in the public healthcare sector. So that's free care, but you may have to queue for 5 or 6 hours to be able to get into a clinic if you don't have an appointment. We do have insulin access, which is amazing. Many countries don't have insulin access, many developing countries. And you should get test strips to be able to test your blood sugar, but it kind of depends a little bit on postcode lottery on which clinic you go to and if they have access and if they are running things the way they should be. So we developed a diabetes rights kind of like educational resource for our community, which was super helpful because that didn't exist anywhere in the country. Like if you have type 1 diabetes, these are your rights. If you have type 2 diabetes, these are your rights. But the public healthcare sector is strained. The private healthcare sector, you pay for it every month. So that's the other 15%. Pay for it every month. I'm lucky enough to be, we call it medical aid. I'm lucky enough to have medical aid. My insulin is delivered to my door every month, as are my strips. I get one CGM for free a month. The other one I have to pay a reduced amount. It's a copay for the second one. On higher tiers of medical aid, insulin pumps are covered. It really depends what you can afford. But the experience, and I get to go to a private endocrinologist 3 or 4 times a year, and a podiatrist every year, and a dietitian every year, and an ophthalmologist every year. And that's all part of my package. That experience is very, very different to the experience of someone, particularly living with type 2 diabetes, which comes with fewer rights, who is accessing their care in the public sector. And so we're very careful to hone in on the things that bring us together rather than the things that split us apart. So what I find fascinating is that our community is largely based on Facebook. So we're on Facebook and Instagram. We have a newsletter and a website, and the website's kind of a trusted diabetes Wikipedia in South Africa. So it has answers to all your questions. But the biggest community factor is on Facebook. And I think we can all agree that Facebook as a product is evil. I don't think anyone would argue against that. But it is weirdly the great equalizer when it comes to socioeconomic background and race and gender and age even. I don't know that we're getting very young, but from 18 to 70, 75 probably, all ages, races, backgrounds are on Facebook. And so we have a really diverse background. And the challenge is to make our advice applicable to everyone. We also have 11 official languages in South Africa, 12 if you count sign language. So while most people speak English, first language English is a very different language to second or third language English. And so we try to keep the information very understandable and the health literacy level of the information at the right level. And then the other thing is that you don't want to skew too much towards type 1. And I think what's fascinating about diabetes, I'm sure it happens in other conditions too. So type 1 diabetes is the autoimmune condition diagnosed in children, but also later I was diagnosed at 25. And the narrative when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes is very positive. It's, okay, you have this chronic condition, you're going to have to inject insulin for the rest of your life, but it doesn't have to stop you from doing anything. You can climb every mountain, ford every stream, you go girl, was pretty much the narrative that everyone who's diagnosed with type 1 is given. Type 2 diabetes is commonly called a lifestyle condition, which is not true because there's also a genetic component. But the narrative is that you develop type 2 if you eat the wrong kind of food and you're carrying extra weight and you're not living the right kind of lifestyle. And so the diagnosis narrative when you're diagnosed with type 2 is, oh, look what you've done to yourself. Look what has happened here. And so there's a lot of blame and shame around type 2. So there's not a lot of, I don't know, calling them diabetes influencers because no one's influencing people to have diabetes, but there's not a lot of diabetes voices. There's far fewer type 2 diabetes voices than there are type 1 diabetes voices. But both conditions require attention. And in fact, 90% of people have type 2, only 10% have type 1. And so what we are aware of as much as the public-private balance is the type 1, type 2 balance. So you don't want to be talking about injections and insulin and going low all the time, which are more type 1 conditions. You want to make sure that it's actually relevant to everyone. It's kind of a big old giant puzzle that we are constantly working on.
I think it's a balancing act, but the fact is that people can meet on Facebook and then perhaps carry on taking the conversation with finding more of their own peers. But the fact is that you've been the enabler to start with is hugely important and still bring people back again. I think that's probably the secret of it. And then sort of moving on to that, because I think, is to talk about lived experience, because that's what people, I believe, when you've got a chronic health condition, are really interested in, is understanding, lived experience. And, how important do you find, is that lived experience when you're building a health community, and sort of finding the balance, which I think is really essential now with AI coming into play, is between what's lived experience and what is actually medical evidence-based information.
It's one of the things that we are really careful about because our whole team has diabetes. So at the moment, there's only two of us. We have 38 years of lived experience between us, but we're being joined later this month, actually, by a third colleague, and he's also coming with 18 years. So then we're going to be, how's me doing maths quickly, 56 years of lived experience. But none of us are medical professionals. And it amazes me, and I don't know how it still amazes me, but it still amazes me that people will message a Facebook page and say, I'm on this much medication and these are my symptoms. What dose should I change to? Like that is not information you should be asking for from a Facebook page. And so we're very careful to, anytime there's anything vaguely medical. Also, foot conditions can develop very rapidly into dangerous situations anytime there's something that is outside the sphere of lifestyle. So we can talk about food, we can talk about exercise, we can talk about mental health, we can talk about like day-to-day coping mechanisms. We don't talk about anything medical at all, and we are very quick to advise people to seek professional help. Like overcautious to advise people to seek professional help, because the last thing you want is for them to waste a week waiting for a Facebook page to reply when actually they need to be going to a clinic or a hospital.
Sorry, just out of interest, do you shut the conversation down by saying you need to go and see a doctor, or do you actually take those conversations off the forum or whatever platform?
Comments on a post that we've posted. If it's a DM straight to us, then we reply straight to that. But usually it's comments on something that we've posted, and we'll comment immediately and say. So I think one of the very practical things that has helped our community to grow is that we respond to every comment, which is an exhausting and exhaustive job. But I think that's the only way you can grow a community, is by people recognizing that when they make a comment, they will get a response. And some comments don't need they can just get a reaction, right? If it's someone being like, oh my gosh, I agree, or me too, that kind of thing. But a lot of the time we're asking like really difficult questions. Last month we were asking about stigma, and one of our questions was, what's the most hurtful thing someone has ever said to you about diabetes? And the responses were heartbreaking. And if someone is sharing something really like legitimate and sincere and heartfelt, they deserve a unique response. And so we're very careful to comment on things that count, and also very quickly on medical things. But then we also have a panel of experts that we ask for advice. So if we are sharing, for example, one of the big problems in South Africa is the type 2 medication, the metformin, the one that's given in public clinics, this is an example of the disparity, is not extended release. It's the original older version of the drug, which often results in diarrhea. And then people stop taking it because they feel worse on the medication than they did beforehand. So we kept getting questions about this, took it to one of our endocrinologists and said, like, what do you advise? Like, what can they do? Obviously, the extended release would be better, but if that's not an option, then what can they do? And he said, if you take it with your dinner, after your dinner, those side effects are severely reduced, which is wonderful, right? And now we can share that information. We'll often ask podiatrists to share tips. We ask dietitians. We did a whole Facebook Live last week with a diabetes psychologist on how to deal with diabetes stigma in the workplace. It's been coming up a lot. And so we ask, if there's something that we can ask an expert that will apply to a group of people in our community, then we get expert input on that. If it's something that's like an individual's medication dose, or sometimes we'll get someone who's living with like 4 or 5 different interlocking chronic conditions, and then they're asking for a meal plan, and we're like, that's actually not something that we have capacity to help with, but also is something that you really should go and get individual help on. So some things can be kind of broadly applied, and some things I think people need to go and see someone one-on-one.
Yeah, funny enough, my next question is, what do people come and look for support and help? Is it practical or is it emotional? And I think actually you probably covered that answer there by saying all these different things that you cover, and presumably that's because people have asked you, are you looking for the themes that come out in the chat to then progress that further?
We are looking, so we're just listening all the time. So the way we know it's time to have a Facebook Live is if we're getting the same kind of question coming up all the time, because then you can really unpack things over an hour with an expert. People can ask you questions, but you can gather also the questions that have been asked on the page and get them answered. We give tips all the time. So we have started this year doing lived experience tips, like short videos from Shiara, my colleague, and myself, on like our top tips about living with diabetes. And then we share a lot of real stories. And that's actually the thing that people seem to love the most, is when someone has a direct, specific question about some aspect of their life, and we'll post it direct speech. So Shalini is looking for advice. Can you help? And then it'll be like, this is what's driving me nuts about diabetes at the moment. Do you have any advice? And then people can share their experience. And again, not medical. And if it is medical, we will comment and say, we can't share medical advice. But I think the thing that people are coming to most is just a sense of community, like a sense of not having to do this on their own. And it's funny because I think each person with diabetes assumes that everyone else has it easier than they do. So I posted a question the one day in some frustration where I was just like, how much support would you say your family gives you, like on a scale of 1 to 10? And there were a couple of people who were like, and I expected people to say, so much support. Oh my goodness, so much support. And there were a couple of people who are like 10 out of 10. My family's amazing. They pack me my lunchbox in the morning. Most people were like, oh my gosh, none at all. Like, I don't get any special treatment. I have to ask if I want anything. And it's so lovely to feel like you're not the only one, and that you're not kind of going crazy in your head with this. It's the same way I felt about when I met other people who were grieving, when I was grieving, and I was like, oh, okay, this is not just in my head. It's actually all of us together. And at the same time, to have that shorthand, right? So I don't have to say, if I have a really bad low, like a while ago, I posted the morning after I'd had a really bad low, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so awful. Like my blood sugar went low last night. I don't know why. I must have overdosed for dinner, and it took like an hour to come up again. And then of course it went high, and it was high all night, and I feel like I've been hit by a bus. And so many people were just like, oh, I feel you. I've had that. It's the worst. Hope you feel better. Drink lots of water. Try and get a rest today. But if I had tried to explain that to my lovely family or my lovely friends, they don't know what a low feels like, and they don't know what a high feels like, and they don't know how frustrating it is when you've eaten the same thing you've eaten so many times before, but for some reason today the medication works differently, or you're more stressed, or you slept differently, or the weather is different, or there's 42 different factors that affect diabetes. It's so nice to just be able to speak to others in shorthand, and I think that's what people come back for.
And I think also the other thing, and what you've sort of spat out very eloquently, is that for any chronic condition, people are, they're happy to support you to start with. Then they sort of get bored with it.
It's very boring.
And then you feel bad. They get bored with hearing, oh, not again, really? Bridget, you know this, and then you start, it's the same when you go to medics, isn't it? So I know those people that they give up going to the doctors because they say, oh, they've got nothing else to say to me. But it doesn't take away from the fact you still have the issue, you still have the problem, you've still got to get on with your life. And sometimes you just want to moan to somebody about it. And somebody that understands exactly what you're going through.
And I think that's so good for your mental health, to be able to moan to someone who understands what you're going through and who can not try and fix it and just be like, oh yeah, this sucks, because it's chronic, right? Like there are ebbs and flows in any chronic condition.
There's no fix.
And sometimes you actually just need to be listened to. But I will say, when it comes to medical professionals, the hugest difference is those who feel they know everything and need to teach you about your condition, and those who recognize that actually someone with 24 hours a day experience knows a hell of a lot, but maybe they can help you interpret what you know differently. That's the sign, I think, of a really good healthcare professional who will listen to you and listen to what you think the problem is, and then work with you to figure out what the problem actually is with their medical expertise.
And in fact, my next question, which once again leads on to my next question, which works really well. What's the one thing that you would like healthcare professionals, researchers, or industry organisations to understand? Or often, what do you think they often misunderstand about people living with diabetes?
It's funny because I spoke at the SEMSA is the organization for endocrinologists and doctors with a special interest in diabetes. And I spoke at their conference recently about just this topic. So I have a lot I could say about it. But in essence, I think there's a temptation when you're working with people with a certain condition, particularly a chronic condition, I think there's a temptation to think that that's all they have going on in their lives. So like the people with diabetes, especially, and I think language comes into this a lot. So I was saying it was part of our stigma campaign, and I was saying we really need to change the language around diabetes. Like we're not suffering from a disease, we're managing a condition. Rather than calling us diabetics, call us people with diabetes. And the reason for that is that it's very easy to judge a label. It's easy to say, oh, the diabetics are non-compliant because they're not eating right. It's much harder to say people with diabetes don't manage their blood sugar all the time because they're not eating right, because that obviously no one can eat perfectly all the time, but also because our condition is not the only thing going on in our lives. Like all of us have jobs. We are parents, or we're looking after parents, which is equally difficult either way, or we're doing both at the same time. We are siblings and friends, and we are trying to exercise, and we have hobbies, and we have all these different roles that we play in life. And then we're given a chronic condition on top of that. And we have this so there's this global language matters movement that we borrowed from. It started with Diabetes Australia, and we made the South African version of it. But they have this beautiful comparative chart that says, instead of this word, try this word, or instead of this word or phrase. And one of them is, instead of non-compliant, try is not a priority right now. And I love that so much, because sometimes diabetes is not a priority. And it has to be in the top 5 because it's a serious chronic condition, but sometimes it's not the top one, and that's fine. That's just life. And I think that's really hard for healthcare professionals to wrap their heads around, because when we see them, we are only in the context of living in our chronic condition.
Yes. And why can't you just do that? Because that's really simple to do every day. Well, no, it's not simple to do every day.
And 15 other things that have nothing to do with diabetes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then moving on really to my last question is, what have you learned from your community in the last year that's actually really surprised you?
I love this question because it speaks to the fact that communities are ever evolving. And I think that's fascinating. So one of our big projects that we recently finished the pilot of is a chatbot, a WhatsApp diabetes education chatbot. And my colleague Chiara traveled around South Africa to each of the 9 provinces and met with groups, so support groups or groups at clinics or groups of healthcare professionals, and had these feedback sessions where she went through the chatbot with them and then asked a bunch of other questions as well. So it was like a research project. And what we wanted to know is, what format do people want education in, diabetes education in? And along with the rest of the world, we assumed it would all be online, right? Like, give it to me on my phone, give me videos, give me podcasts, give me voice notes. And a number of people, so the stats that came out, the thing they wanted most was video, which makes sense. And I think video is just easier to digest. I think we've now been trained into digesting video, but also from a very practical perspective in South Africa, if we can get video right and we can get it people speaking the right language, someone who speaks the right language and looks like you and is speaking up about having diabetes, that kind of kills 2 birds with one stone, and that it also reduces stigma, because there's people speaking openly about living with diabetes. And so video is very important, and it's one of the things we're focusing on. But the second most popular thing was books and pamphlets from the clinic. And I thought that was so fascinating because everyone loves saying that print is dead. And I don't believe that print is dead. And now our community told us that print is not dead. And I think it's because we still want something to hold, and we want something that we can take home and digest in our own time and read quietly and absorb, and then also share with the people around us so that our very close-knit, practical, physical community can also understand what it is that we're going through.
Yeah, and I think it makes it sort of more real, isn't it? Because the trouble is when you read things online, you kind of can flick through it, then go on to the next page, or whiz on to the next site, and then it's actually gone. Whereas something physical is more likely to go in because you're holding it, you're reading it properly as opposed to on a screen. So I can understand, but that's really insightful information, and I would agree, but I completely agree about the video. I think it gets across messages so much more clearly. People understand it because they're consuming it using so many different senses and can hopefully relate to it far more. So, Bridget, thank you so much for your time today. And can we join your community even if we don't live in South
many
Africa?
people have joined our community and are not in South Africa. So our website is sweetlife.org.za. So it's sweetlife.org.za. And we are South Africans with Diabetes on Facebook and sweetlife.org.za on Instagram. And everyone is so welcome.
Brilliant. I will put that information up with this. Bridget, thank you so much for your time today.